I remember the cold. That is what remains most clearly from the moment I died. Not the pain of the heretic's blade as it slid between my ribs, though that was considerable. Not the sound of bolter fire echoing through the cathedral's shattered nave, though that had been deafening moments before. Just the cold. It spread from the wound in my chest like ink in water, turning my fingers numb first, then my arms, creeping up toward my heart with patient inevitability. I tried to breathe and tasted copper and smoke. The air was thick with burning promethium and the acrid stench of corrupted flesh. My knees buckled. The stone floor rose to meet me with surprising gentleness. I could still see the altar I had been defending. 40 paces away, maybe less, its golden aquila blackened by fire but still standing. I had kept my oath. The sacred space remained uncorrupted. That should have been enough. I closed my eyes and waited for the Emperor's peace, for the silence that was supposed to follow faithful service. The sounds of battle grew distant, muffled, as if I were sinking beneath dark water. My heartbeat slowed. Once. Twice. Then nothing. The silence lasted for exactly 3 seconds. Then I burned. It started in my chest where the wound had been, a sensation like molten gold poured directly into my veins. I tried to scream but had no breath. The fire spread outward with terrible purpose, consuming nerve endings, rewriting flesh, transforming everything it touched. My back arched against the stone floor as something erupted from my shoulder blades. Not the tearing of skin I expected, but a rupture of reality itself. Wings. I understood that word before I could see them. Wings of pure light, golden and impossible, spreading from my body as if they had always been there, waiting beneath the skin for permission to emerge. The pain should have killed me. Perhaps it did. Perhaps I died a second time in that moment and simply did not notice because something else was happening. Something worse than death or resurrection. The Emperor's attention found me. Not the distant, abstract presence I had prayed to throughout my life as a battle sister. Not the cold comfort of faith maintained through discipline and ritual. This was direct. This was immediate. This was his will flooding into my consciousness like a tsunami of molten metal, filling every space where my thoughts had been, burning away doubt and fear, and everything that had made me an individual soul capable of independent existence. I felt him looking through my eyes at the battlefield around us, felt his satisfaction at the altar still standing, felt his need, vast and terrible and utterly beyond my comprehension. And beneath it all, I felt his pain. 10,000 years of agony on the golden throne, compressed into a single instant of shared experience that should have shattered my mind completely. Then came the prayers, all at once. Every faithful soul on that world and beyond, every voice raised in desperate supplication, every plea for salvation and mercy and vengeance. They crashed against my awareness like waves against stone. Billions of them, each one demanding something I did not know how to give. I heard a girl begging for her mother's life, a soldier praying for courage, an old man asking forgiveness for sins I did not understand. They saw me now, not as I was, but as what I had become. A saint, a miracle, an answer to prayers I had never agreed to hear. I tried to speak my own name and could not remember it. The syllables felt foreign in my mouth, belonging to someone who no longer existed. What remained was something new, something that wore my face but answered to a higher purpose, something that would rise from this battlefield trailing light and faith and the terrible weight of divine expectation. I opened my eyes and saw my hands wreathed in golden fire that did not consume. The wound in my chest had closed, leaving only unblemished skin that glowed softly from within. Around me, The survivors of my squad knelt in the ash and blood, their faces turned upward with expressions of awe and terror. They whispered words I barely heard over the roaring silence in my skull. Living saint, the Emperor's chosen. Blessed one. I wanted to tell them they were wrong, that I was still just a battle sister whose name I could no longer speak, that this was not blessing but something else entirely, something that felt like being unmade and reformed into a shape I had never chosen. But when I opened my mouth, the voice that emerged was mine, and not mine. It carried harmonics that human vocal cords should not produce. It spoke words of faith and duty that I did not remember deciding to say. The battle continued around us. The heretics still held half the cathedral. My squad looked to me for orders, for guidance, for the miracle they believed I represented. I stood. The wings moved with me, responding to intention rather than conscious thought. The golden fire intensified, and somewhere deep inside, beneath the divine presence that had filled every corner of my consciousness, a small voice screamed. But no one heard it. No one ever would. Sometimes, in the moments between battles, I try to remember who I was before the fire claimed me. The memories come like fragments of broken glass, sharp and incomplete, cutting me with their clarity even as they slip away the moment I try to grasp them fully. There was a name once. I spoke it every morning during roll call in the Schola Progenium, a compound of syllables that belonged to me and no one else. It started with a hard consonant, I think, or perhaps a soft vowel. The sound of it dissolves like smoke whenever I reach for it, leaving only the ghost of familiarity and the certain knowledge that something precious has been lost. I remember the Schola itself more clearly. Grey stone corridors that smelled of incense and cleaning solution. The chapel where we knelt for hours on cold, marble floors, reciting catechisms until the words lost all meaning and became simple rhythm. The training yard where drill sergeants shouted corrections at girls who were learning to kill in the Emperor's name. I was 12 when they brought me there, or perhaps 11. The details blur, but I remember the weight of the wooden practice bolter in my hands, how my arms shook from exhaustion after the first day of weapons drill. I was not exceptional. This matters, though I am not certain why. Among the dozens of girls in my training cohort, I was neither the best shot nor the worst, neither the most pious nor the most doubting. I memorized the Fede Imperialis with adequate speed and executed firing drills with acceptable accuracy. When the sororitas came to select candidates for full induction, I was chosen not because I stood out, but because I had made no mistakes significant enough to be remembered. The faces of my sisters from those days hover at the edge of memory. There was one with red hair who laughed too loudly during evening prayers and was disciplined for it repeatedly. Another who never spoke unless spoken to, whose silence felt like armor against a world too harsh to face directly. A third who excelled at close combat and died during our first deployment, her throat opened by Xenos claws before she could fire a single shot. I wept for her then. I remember weeping, but I cannot remember her name, and that absence feels like a sin I have no way to atone for. My first battle was on a world whose designation I no longer recall. Orcs, green and massive and impossibly loud, pouring across a hab-block district with the single-minded purpose of creatures who existed only to fight. I remember the weight of my bolter, heavier now that it was real and loaded with shells meant to tear through flesh and bone. I remember the smell of burning promethium and the sound of my squad leader's voice over the vox, calm and precise as she directed our fire. I killed 3 orcs that day, or perhaps 5. The number seemed important once. What I remember most clearly is the silence afterward. We knelt among the bodies and gave thanks to the Emperor for our victory, for our survival, for the privilege of serving his will. I prayed with the others, speaking words I had been trained to speak, and waited for something to answer. Some sense of connection, or purpose, or divine acknowledgement that our faith meant something beyond the tactical advantage it provided. Nothing came. The Emperor remained distant, as he had always been, as I believed he would always be. Faith was not about feeling his presence. Faith was about service despite his silence, about maintaining devotion to an entity so far beyond human comprehension that expecting direct contact seemed like the height of arrogance. I was content with that. Or perhaps content is the wrong word. I was accepting. I understood my place in the vast machinery of the Imperium. A single bolt shell in an infinite magazine. A single voice among billions raised in prayer that would never be individually answered because the Emperor had more important concerns than the hopes and fears of one ordinary battle sister. I never imagined he would notice me. I never wanted him to. The distance between the divine and the mortal felt safe, comfortable, right. I was wrong about so many things. The Emperor's attention found me on Varsavia Prime, and I have never forgiven myself for drawing his gaze. The planet was a hive world, one of thousands scattered across the Imperium's endless expanse. Its sky had not seen stars in living memory, choked instead by the accumulated pollution of 17 billion souls, packed into towers that scraped against the upper atmosphere. When the heretics came, they brought fire with them. The sky turned from grey to orange to a sick, burning red that reminded me of infected wounds. We were deployed to hold the Cathedral of St. Arabella, while evacuation transports ferried civilians from the lower hives. The structure was ancient, its foundations laid during the age of apostasy, its walls carved with the names of martyrs whose deeds had long since faded into legend. Our orders were simple: hold for 72 hours, allow no desecration of sacred ground, expect no reinforcement. There were 23 of us when the siege began, battle sisters of the Order of the Valorous Heart, each one trained to die with faith on her lips and fury in her heart. We fortified the entrances, positioned heavy bolters at strategic choke points, and prepared the cathedral's defenders for the assault we knew was coming. The heretics arrived at sunset on the first day. Not the ragged cultists we had expected, but corrupted guardsmen who had turned from the Emperor's light and embraced the ruinous powers. They wore uniforms we recognized, bore weapons issued by the Departamento Munitorum, spoke prayers we had once shared before their faith had curdled into something obscene. They charged the cathedral steps in waves, and we cut them down with bolter fire and righteous fury. Sister Mara died on the first night, her head taken by a sniper we never located. Sister Evangeline fell on the second day, dragged screaming into the heretic lines by cultists who overwhelmed her position. By the third morning, we were 11. By midday, 7. We held not because we believed reinforcement would come, but because retreat was unthinkable. The cathedral was sacred ground. Our bodies would pile at its entrance before we allowed corruption to touch its altar. The champion came at dusk on the third day. I saw him emerge from the smoke and flames that had consumed the plaza beyond the cathedral steps. He was massive, armored in plate that had once been imperial, but now bore symbols that made my eyes ache to look upon directly. His weapon was a power maul, its surface crackling with malevolent energy, covered in inscriptions that seemed to writhe and twist when viewed peripherally. He walked with the confidence of something that had forgotten what it meant to fear death. He killed Sister Jessamine with his first blow, crushing her helm and the skull beneath it. Sister Korobeth lasted 3 seconds longer, her chainsword shattering against his armor before his maul found her chest. The others were dead or dying, their positions overrun by heretics who had used the champion's assault as cover for their final push. I stood between him and the altar, just me. One battle sister whose name I can no longer recall, armed with a bolter that had 3 rounds remaining and a combat knife I had carried since the schola. The mathematics were clear. I could not win. I could only choose where I would fall. The champion laughed when he saw me. The sound was wrong, layered with harmonics that suggested multiple voices speaking in unison. He raised his maul and advanced with the casual certainty of an executioner approaching the block. I fired my last 3 rounds into his chest. They sparked harmlessly against his armor. Then I dropped the bolter and drew my knife and threw myself forward, because that was all that remained. Not strategy or skill or hope of victory, just the willingness to die standing between corruption and sanctity. His maul caught me in the ribs as I closed the distance. I felt bones shatter like pottery dropped on stone. The air left my lungs in a rush that took blood with it. I fell, my knife clattering uselessly against the marble floor. The cold came quickly after that. I lay at the base of the altar steps and watched the champion advance toward the sacred space I had failed to protect. My vision narrowed to a tunnel, darkness creeping in from the edges. This was death. I had seen it take my sisters throughout the 3-day siege. Now it would take me. I prayed not for salvation, but for forgiveness, for failing in my duty, for letting corruption touch ground I had sworn to defend. Then something answered. Not the distant, silent presence I had prayed to my entire life. Something immediate, something vast, a consciousness so immense that my dying mind could barely process its edges. It reached into the darkness where my life was fading and pulled. Not gently, with the irresistible force of a riptide dragging a swimmer from shore. I wanted to let go, to accept the peace that death promised. But the Emperor would not allow it. The golden fire that had consumed me from within began to fade, settling into my flesh like embers banked for a long night. I opened eyes I had not realized were closed and saw the cathedral around me transformed. The walls that had been blackened by smoke now gleamed as if freshly consecrated. The altar that corruption had nearly claimed shone with a light that had nothing to do with the setting sun beyond the shattered dome. And the champion who had killed me lay dead at my feet, his armor scorched by fires that had left no mark on the marble floor. I did not remember striking him down. I did not remember standing. But I was standing now, and from my shoulders spread wings that should not exist in any reality, governed by the laws of physics I had learned in the schola. They were not made of feathers or flesh. They were light given form, golden and radiant, stretching 4 meters from tip to tip. When I tried to move them, they responded like limbs I had possessed all my life, folding and extending with effortless grace. I could feel the air moving across their surface, though that surface was composed of nothing solid enough to displace atmosphere. The survivors emerged from where they had sheltered during the final assault. Not just battle sisters, though 3 of my squad still lived, but civilians who had refused evacuation. Pilgrims who had come to the cathedral seeking the Emperor's protection and found something they had never expected. They approached slowly, their faces reflecting a mixture of awe and terror that I recognized from the faces of those who had witnessed miracles in the paintings that decorated our chapter house. One by one, they knelt. The gesture should have been familiar. I had seen faithful citizens kneel before canonist superiors, before relics, before altars, but they were not kneeling to an authority figure or a sacred object. They were kneeling to me. Their lips moved in prayers I could hear with perfect clarity despite the distance between us. That was when I realized something had broken in the way I perceived sound. The prayers were not just words carried on air. They were thoughts made manifest, pressing against my consciousness with physical weight. I heard an old man 3 rows back begging for his grandson's life. A young woman in the 4th pew, pleading for strength to endure what the siege had cost her. A child whose mother had died in the bombardment, asking why the emperor had allowed such suffering. Then the prayers began coming from beyond the cathedral, from the hab blocks surrounding the plaza, from the underhive levels where refugees huddled in darkness, from across the entire hive city and beyond, spreading outward like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Millions of voices, each one distinct, each one demanding something I did not know how to provide. The weight of them drove me to my knees. I tried to close my ears, to shut out the overwhelming tide of desperate faith, but there was no barrier I could raise. The prayers were not external sounds that could be blocked. They existed inside my skull, woven into my consciousness as thoroughly as my own thoughts. I tried to speak, to tell the people kneeling before me that they were mistaken, that I was just a battle sister who had fallen in defense of sacred ground. But the voice that emerged from my throat was mine and not mine. It carried harmonics that human vocal cords should not produce, layered with echoes that suggested vastness beyond comprehension. "The Emperor protects," I said, and the words resonated through the cathedral with the weight of divine pronouncement. The faithful responded with renewed fervor. Their prayers intensified. More voices joined the chorus, pressing against my awareness. "Living saint," they whispered. "The Emperor's chosen. Blessed one. Miracle worker." Each title felt like another chain wrapping around what remained of my identity. I reached for my armor, intending to remove my helm, to show them the face of an ordinary woman beneath the symbol they were creating. My gauntlets would not release. The ceramite had fused to my flesh during the resurrection, merged so completely that I could not determine where armor ended and skin began. I pulled harder, panic rising in my chest, but the armor would not yield. The wings. I focused on the wings spreading from my shoulders, willing them to disappear, to retract, to release me from this form I had never chosen. They remained. Brilliant and terrible and utterly beyond my control. A sister from my squad approached, her face tear-streaked, her armor scorched from 3 days of desperate fighting. She reached out to touch the edge of my wing and gasped as her fingers passed through the light without resistance. "It is a miracle," she whispered. "The Emperor has returned you to us. He has made you his instrument." Instrument. The word settled into my mind with the weight of prophecy. I was no longer a soldier who could choose her battles or rest between deployments. I was something else now. Something that existed to be pointed at threats and unleashed with divine fury. Something that could not remove its armor or dismiss its wings or silence the endless prayers that had become the permanent backdrop of its existence. I looked at the faces surrounding me. They saw salvation. They saw hope. They saw the Emperor's will made manifest in flesh and light. I saw the prison I would inhabit for however long his purpose required my service. And I understood, with perfect and terrible clarity, that the bars of that prison were forged from the very faith I had spent my life defending. The days after Varsavia Prime blurred together like ink running in water. Or perhaps it was weeks, months. Time began to move strangely around me, measured not by the turning of worlds, but by the spaces between deployments, between deaths. The second time I died, it was on a frontier world whose name I never learned. Tyrannid organisms had emerged from the ash wastes, their chittering advance preceded by the psychic scream that announced the hive mind's hunger. I led the defense not because I held rank, but because the faithful looked to me for miracles, because the wings spreading from my shoulders had become a banner more potent than any chapter standard. The Tyrannid warrior was fast, faster than anything armored so heavily should have been. Its scything talons pierced through my breastplate as if the blessed ceramite were parchment. I felt the tips punch through my ribcage, felt them scrape against my spine, felt the precise moment when one talon found my heart and pierced it cleanly through. The cold came again, welcome and familiar as an old friend. I let myself fall into it, grateful for the release. This time would be different, I told myself. This time the Emperor would let me rest. I had served. I had inspired the faithful to victory. Surely that was enough. It was not enough. The golden fire erupted from my chest with violence that made the first resurrection feel gentle by comparison. It burned through me, rebuilding tissue and bone and organ with cruel precision. But it went deeper this time. I felt it rewriting something fundamental in my flesh, in my blood, in the very structure of cells that no longer quite belonged to me. When I opened my eyes, the Tyrannid lay dead at my feet, and the faithful were weeping with joy around my resurrected form. I wanted to weep with them, not from joy, but from the horror of understanding that had crystallized during that second return. I could not die, not truly. Death had become merely an interruption, a temporary darkness before the burning return. The third death came on a world consumed by orc hordes. A crude axe took my head. The fourth happened during a boarding action against Chaos Raiders, explosive decompression and the Void's embrace. The fifth was on a shrine world where heretics had poisoned the water supply. I died with millions of pilgrims, my body convulsing as toxins shut down organs one by one. Each time, the cold. Each time, the brief hope that this would be the final darkness. Each time, the golden fire dragging me back with increasing violence. The resurrections began to blur together. I would wake screaming in fields of corpses, surrounded by the faithful who had witnessed my martyrdom and subsequent return. They praised the Emperor for his miracle. They wept tears of religious ecstasy. They touched the hem of my robes and begged for blessings I no longer had the strength to deny. I began to fear sleep, not because rest itself was unpleasant, but because my dreams had become an endless catalogue of deaths. I relived each one with perfect clarity. The Tyrannid's talons, the Orc's axe, the Void's cold embrace, the poison burning through my veins. Again and again, in infinite variation, my subconscious mind processing trauma that should have ended with the cessation of consciousness, but instead became permanent memories etched into whatever I was becoming. The sixth death, the seventh, I lost count somewhere around the 12th, on a world where I threw myself into a demon's maw to prevent it from consuming a scholar full of children. The 21st was on a forge world, crushed beneath a collapsing manufactorum. The 33rd happened so quickly I barely registered the weapon that ended me before the fire brought me back. Time lost all meaning. I existed in a state of perpetual deployment, moved from crisis to crisis like a piece on a regicide board. The spaces between battles grew shorter. The resurrections grew more agonizing. And with each return, I felt more of myself burning away, replaced by something that served the Emperor's purpose with mechanical efficiency, but felt less human with every passing moment. I tried once to remain dead. On a world whose name I never learned, I let an enemy blade find my throat and consciously resisted when the golden fire tried to reclaim me. I pushed back against the Emperor's will, begging him to let me go, to grant me the peace that every other faithful servant eventually received. His response was to burn hotter. The resurrection that followed took 3 full minutes, during which my body convulsed and smoked and glowed with light bright enough to blind those who watched. When I finally stood, gasping and whole, I understood the message he had sent without words. I was his instrument. Instruments do not choose when their service ends. They are used until they break, and I had been forged from materials that would not break, could not break. The Emperor's will had made me eternal, and eternity was the cruelest punishment I could have imagined. The communion came during a moment I had not chosen. After the 47th death, or perhaps the 51st, numbers had ceased to carry meaning. I had been brought to a chapel on a cardinal world whose name I no longer remember. The faithful needed to see me kneel before an altar, needed the symbolic confirmation that even living saints required prayer and reflection. It was theater. I understood that. But I performed my role because refusing would have served no purpose. The chapel was old, its walls carved from stone quarried during the age of apostasy. Candles burned in alcoves dedicated to martyrs whose names had been worn smooth by 10,000 years of pilgrim fingers. The air smelled of incense and melted wax and the accumulated prayers of centuries. I knelt before the altar because that was expected of me. I closed my eyes because I was tired. So tired. That was when he reached out. Not the distant presence that flowed through me during battle, directing my actions with subtle pressure. Not the golden fire that dragged me back from death with violent insistence. This was different. This was the Emperor himself, turning the full weight of his attention toward me, with an intimacy that made my earlier resurrections feel like gentle caresses. I saw through his eyes. The galaxy sprawled beneath his gaze like a three-dimensional map rendered in living light. Billions of worlds, each one a pinprick of illumination against the darkness. Some burned bright with faith, others flickered with the uncertain light of populations who prayed without truly believing. Still others had gone dark, consumed by xenos or heresy, or the simple entropy that claimed all things given sufficient time. I felt his attention moving across that vast expanse, touching worlds in crisis, directing forces beyond my comprehension, making decisions that would doom millions to save billions. Every choice was agony. Every world saved meant another world sacrificed. Every victory came at costs that would have broken mortal minds to contemplate. Then, I felt his pain. 10,000 years on the Golden Throne. 10,000 years of consciousness stretched across the Imperium like a web of nerves exposed to acid. Every psyker consumed to sustain him was a death he witnessed. Every prayer offered to his name was a plea he heard but could rarely answer. Every battle fought in his service was suffering. He experienced through the souls of the faithful. He was dying, had been dying since the day Horus struck him down. The Golden Throne sustained him, but it was failing. Systems built during the dark age of technology breaking down one by one, their functions replaced by the daily sacrifice of psykers whose souls burned to keep the Astronomicon lit and the webway sealed and the Emperor's consciousness tethered to reality. And he could not act directly. His body was a prison. His mind was trapped within mechanisms that barely functioned. The only way he could touch the material universe was through intermediaries, through saints and living miracles, through people like me. The understanding flooded through me with the force of revelation. I was not blessed. I was not chosen for glory or honor. I was a tool, a weapon crafted from my own mortality and resurrected faith. Every death I experienced created a moment where the barriers between living and dead grew thin enough for his will to reach through. Every resurrection was him pouring a fragment of his power into a vessel that could walk and fight and die again on worlds he could never reach. I saw others like me, hundreds of them scattered across the Imperium's expanse. Saints who had died and returned, champions who bore his gifts, each one a conduit for divine will, each one burning themselves away in service of a war that would never end, because the alternative was the extinction of everything human consciousness had ever built. The beauty of it staggered me. the entirety of human civilization sustained by an intricate web of sacrifice, each soul giving what they could, the greatest among them giving everything repeatedly until nothing remained but the purpose that had consumed them. The cruelty of it broke me. I was not a person anymore. I was a hand with which he could grasp, a sword with which he could strike, a voice with which he could inspire. And he would never release me, because releasing me meant one fewer tool in an arsenal that was never sufficient for the threats pressing in from every direction. I felt his sorrow at what he had made me, his gratitude for what I provided, his absolute certainty that there was no alternative. The Imperium survived on sacrifice, and mine was to burn forever in a cycle of death and resurrection that served needs too vast for mortal comprehension. The communion ended as abruptly as it had begun. I opened my eyes and saw the chapel around me unchanged, the candles still burning, the stones still cold beneath my knees. But I was changed. I understood now what I had become and why escape was impossible. The faithful needed their saint. The Emperor needed his instrument, and I no longer existed separate from those needs. The years that followed the communion blurred together like pages in a book left too long in the rain. Or perhaps they were decades, perhaps centuries. Time ceased to function in the linear way I remembered from my mortal life. It became instead a series of deployments punctuated by resurrections, each one bleeding into the next without clear boundaries or memorable transitions. I led crusades across sectors whose names I forgot before the campaigns ended. I inspired faithful soldiers on worlds I would never visit again. I died and returned so many times that the resurrections themselves became routine, predictable as morning prayer, painful as a familiar wound reopened before it could properly heal. And with each return, I felt something slipping away. My name was the first casualty. I tried to remember it during a quiet moment between battles on a forge world where the sky burned with the reflected light of 1,000 manufactorums. The syllables that had once defined my individual identity refused to form. I knew I had possessed a name once. Every person did. But the sounds that should have come when I reached for that memory produced only static, like searching for a deleted file in corrupted databanks. The faces of my squad mates from Varsavia Prime faded next. I could remember that there had been sisters who fought beside me during those 3 days of siege. I could recall the general impression of camaraderie and shared purpose. But when I tried to visualize their features, I found only blurred suggestions of human forms. The one with red hair, the one who never spoke, the one who died first. They had been individuals once, each with their own histories and hopes and fears. Now they were categories, archetypes, symbols of sacrifice rather than people I had known. I tried to remember the taste of simple food. Before the resurrections, before the wings, I had eaten corpse starch like every other soldier in the Imperium's service. It had tasted of nothing in particular, but it had been real, physical, mine. Now, when I forced myself to consume rations during campaigns where maintaining appearances seemed important, I tasted only texture. The flavor itself had become an abstract concept I could no longer process. Sunlight. I stood once on a paradise world where the primary star cast warm golden light across fields of grain that stretched to the horizon. The faithful gathered there to witness my blessing of their harvest. I stood in that light and tried to remember what warmth felt like when it came from an external source, rather than the divine fire that sustained my transformed flesh. The memory would not come. My skin no longer registered temperature the way mortal skin did. The warmth I felt now came from within, constant and unvarying, erasing all sense of what it had meant to feel cold or hot, or anything in between. Laughter. I heard it sometimes among the troops I led into battle, young guardsmen joking to mask their fear. veterans sharing stories from previous campaigns. The sounds were familiar in an abstract way, but I could not remember what it felt like to laugh for reasons that had nothing to do with witnessing the Emperor's enemies destroyed. Had I laughed once? Surely I must have. But the emotional context that would make such an action meaningful had been burned away by fires that consumed everything not essential to my function. Each resurrection took more. I began to notice the pattern after the 100th death, or perhaps the 200th. The golden fire that rebuilt my flesh was not restoring what had been. It was refining, purifying, burning away the human components that had made me an individual and replacing them with divine purpose that needed no identity beyond its function. Fear faded like morning frost under harsh sun. I walked into battles that should have terrified me and felt only the certainty of purpose. Even knowing I would die, knowing the pain that death would bring and the agony of resurrection that would follow, I felt nothing resembling the visceral terror that had once made my hands shake during my first deployment. Doubt became impossible. Questions that should have troubled me about the cost of our victories, about the civilians sacrificed to strategic necessity, about the rightness of decisions made in the Emperor's name. These considerations simply failed to materialize. My mind moved in channels carved by divine will, flowing always toward predetermined conclusions that served his purpose. Hope for anything beyond the Emperor's will ceased to exist. I no longer dreamed of rest or peace or release. Those concepts belonged to individuals who possessed futures worth imagining. I was not an individual. I was an instrument, and instruments did not hope. They served. The prayers of the faithful grew louder with each passing campaign. Millions of voices pressed against my consciousness at every moment, their desperate pleas and expressions of devotion filling spaces where my own thoughts should have been. I found myself responding to their needs automatically, without conscious decision. The blessings I offered, the words of inspiration I spoke, the miracles I performed, none of it came from deliberate choice anymore. It simply flowed through me like water through a pipe. I was becoming what they believed me to be, not a person who had been transformed by divine intervention, but the transformation itself, a living symbol, a walking miracle, a weapon wrapped in human form that grew less human with each use. The world we saved was called Meridian's Hope, though I only learned that from the banners the faithful raised in celebration. They lined the processional route from the landing field to the planetary governor's palace. Millions of them, their voices raised in hymns that praised the emperor and the saint he had sent to deliver them from corruption. I walked through their adoration like a statue being carried in procession. The wings spread from my shoulders glowed with light that cast no shadows. My armor, fused permanently to flesh that no longer quite qualified as human, reflected their tear-streaked faces back at them. They saw salvation. They saw hope. They saw everything they needed me to be. I saw nothing, not the way I once had. I registered their presence as data, population density, emotional state, potential threats. But the human connection that should have made their joy meaningful had been burned away so thoroughly that I could no longer remember what it felt like to care about the opinions of people I had saved. They had built shrines during the month it took to cleanse their world of heresy, rough structures erected in haste, decorated with symbols they believed represented my essence. The wings featured prominently, the golden light, the armor that never showed damage no matter how many times I died and returned. I passed a dozen such shrines during the procession and felt nothing at their construction. Children bore my name now. Not the name I had been born with, which had been consumed by the fires of transformation, but the title the ecclesiarchy had assigned me. Saint Illuminata, they called me, for the light I carried. I heard mothers shouting the name as they held infants toward me, desperate for my gaze to fall upon their children, as if proximity to my presence could confer some protection against the cruelties of a galaxy that cared nothing for human suffering. Statues rose in the central plaza, carved from stone quarried from the world's northern mountains, depicting me at 3 times human height, with wings spread wide and sword raised high. The sculptor had tried to capture expression on my face, some hint of the righteous fury or divine serenity they imagined a saint should display. But the marble face looked as empty as I felt inside, and I wondered if the artist had seen more truly than they intended. The procession ended at the cathedral steps where a girl waited. She could not have been more than 8 years old, dressed in the simple grey robes of a pilgrim, her hands clasped together in prayer. Behind her stood a woman whose wasted frame and labored breathing spoke of sickness that the planet's basic medical services could not cure. The girl approached with steps made careful by reverence and terror in equal measure. When she spoke, her voice carried across the suddenly silent plaza with surprising clarity. "Holy One," she said, "my mother is dying. The physicians say she has perhaps a week remaining. Please, I know you have saved thousands. I am only asking you to save one, more." The crowd held its breath. This was the moment they had gathered to witness, the miracle they needed to believe in, the confirmation that faith, sincere and desperate, would be answered by the saint who had delivered their world from darkness. I looked down at the girl and felt the familiar pressure of millions of prayers pressing against my consciousness. They needed this. The Emperor's purpose required it. My function was clear. I placed my hand on the child's head. The golden fire that sustained my existence flowed through my palm into her small body, and through her into the woman who waited behind her with the resigned patience of someone who had already accepted death. I felt the fire seek out the corruption in the woman's cells, the malignant growths that were consuming her from within, and burn them away with surgical precision. The woman gasped. Color returned to her cheeks. Strength flooded back into limbs that had grown weak with illness. She stood straight for the first time in months and stared at her hands as if seeing them for the first time. The crowd erupted, their voices raised in hymns of praise and religious ecstasy. They wept with joy at this confirmation that the Emperor saw their suffering and answered their prayers through his chosen saint. The girl threw her arms around my legs and sobbed her gratitude into my armor. I felt nothing, no joy at the life I had saved, no satisfaction at the faith I had confirmed, no connection to these people who loved me with an intensity that should have been overwhelming. The miracle had flowed through me like water through a pipe. Automatic, mechanical, empty of any meaning beyond the function it served. I understood then what I had become. Not a person ascending toward divinity, but a person being erased by it. The human components that had once made me capable of feeling joy or sorrow or satisfaction had been systematically burned away by resurrections that replaced mortal flesh with whatever substance could contain divine will without being consumed entirely. I was precisely what the Emperor needed, a miracle that felt nothing, questioned nothing, simply burned with holy purpose, a weapon that could be pointed at threats and unleashed without hesitation or doubt, a symbol pure enough to inspire the faithful because nothing remained inside me to contradict the perfection they projected onto my empty form. The human had been burned away. Only the saint remained, and the saint felt nothing at all. That night, I found myself alone in a cathedral, on a world whose name had already slipped from my memory. The faithful had finally dispersed after hours of celebration, returning to homes they could rebuild now that corruption had been purged from their world. The governor had offered me chambers befitting a saint. I had declined. Saints did not need rest. Everyone knew that. but I needed something. Some moment of silence away from the endless pressure of prayers and expectations. Some space where I could exist without performing the role that had consumed everything I had been. I knelt before the altar in darkness, broken only by the light of my own wings. The irony was not lost on me. I had come seeking privacy, but I carried my own illumination, my own constant reminder of what I had become. There was no darkness deep enough to hide in anymore. I tried to pray, not the formal catechisms I had memorized in the schola, not the battle prayers I spoke before each engagement. Real prayer, the desperate plea of a drowning soul reaching for anything that might pull them from the depths. Please, I whispered to the darkness beyond my light, let me die, truly die. Grant me the peace you give to every other faithful servant. I have served, I have burned, I have given everything. Let it be enough. The silence stretched. For a moment I thought he would not answer, that even this final request would be ignored like all the others I had made during quiet moments between battles. Then he reached out, not with the violent force of resurrection or the overwhelming presence of communion. This was cold, precise, understanding flowing into me like starlight through vacuum, and with that understanding came visions. I saw myself extinguished, the light I carried going dark, and in that darkness, I saw worlds falling. The faithful who had drawn strength from my example losing hope and succumbing to despair. Soldiers who had fought believing the Emperor sent miracles to aid them breaking before enemies they might have overcome. Children who carried my name growing up in a galaxy slightly darker for my absence. Not because I was special, not because I was irreplaceable, but because the symbol I had become served a purpose in the Emperor's vast calculation of survival and sacrifice. Remove one piece from the equation, and the balance shifted. Other pieces would have to compensate. Other sacrifices would be required. He showed me others like me. Saints scattered across 10,000 years of imperial history. Men and women who had died and returned, who had burned with holy purpose until nothing human remained. I saw Saint Celestine falling and rising on battlefields across the Imperium. I saw nameless martyrs whose resurrections had inspired worlds I would never visit. I saw the pattern repeated endlessly, each saint believing themselves unique until the moment they understood they were simply the latest iteration of a necessity that predated their birth and would continue long after their final dissolution. All of them had prayed for release at some point. All of them had begged for the peace of true death. And all of them had received the same answer, the same cold understanding, the same impossible choice that was not a choice at all. The Imperium survived on sacrifice. Some gave their lives once in glorious martyrdom. Others gave their labor across decades of faithful service. And a few, chosen by criteria beyond mortal comprehension, gave themselves repeatedly, endlessly, until nothing remained but the burning purpose that had consumed them. Mine was not a special torment. It was simply the form my service took. The Emperor needed hands that could grasp, swords that could strike, symbols that could inspire, and he had made me into all three, using the raw material of my faith and mortality to craft something that served needs too vast for individual concerns to matter. I could resist, I could beg, I could rage against the role I had been forced to inhabit, or I could accept with grace and dignity the fate that had been chosen for me. Or I could simply stop fighting because fighting and accepting were equally meaningless. The person who could have made that choice was already dead, had died on Varsavia Prime when the champion's maul crushed her ribs, and the Emperor's fire had claimed her before natural death could. What had returned was not her. Not really. I was the saint, the symbol, the living miracle, and the human who had once inhabited this form, was gone beyond any resurrection's power to restore. I stopped praying. There was nothing left to pray for. No release to beg for. No alternative to hope for. There was only this. The eternal burning. The endless cycle. The purpose that would use me until I was finally consumed completely, and another would rise to take my place. I stood. The wings spread automatically, responding to intention I no longer consciously formed. Beyond the cathedral, I could hear the faithful beginning to stir with the dawn. Soon they would come seeking blessings and miracles and confirmation that the Emperor watched over them, and I would provide what they needed. Not because I chose to, but because choice itself had been burned away, along with everything else that had made me human. The transformation was complete. The battlefield exists beneath stars I do not recognize on a world whose name I will forget before the campaign ends. The enemy does not matter. Heretics or Xenos or corrupted imperial forces, the distinction carries no weight. They are obstacles to be removed, threats to be neutralized, fuel for the fire that burns where a person once lived. I move through their ranks with wings spread wide, golden light casting everything in sharp relief. The faithful follow behind me, their voices raised in hymns I no longer truly hear. They are background noise, like the wind or the distant thunder of artillery, present but not requiring acknowledgement. The killing blow comes from a weapon I do not see, fired by an enemy I do not notice until the last round punches through my chest and vaporizes my heart. The cold spreads quickly. Familiar, expected. I fall among the corpses of those I have killed and wait for what comes next. The golden fire erupts with violence that no longer registers as pain, just sensation, data. The rebuilding of tissue and bone and organ happens with mechanical precision. I observe my own resurrection with the detachment of someone watching events unfold to another person in another life. The wings reform. The light intensifies. The faithful who witnessed my fall weep with joy at my return. I stand. The words they need to hear flow from my mouth without conscious thought. Prayers of victory, promises of the Emperor's protection, assurances that faith, sincere and absolute, will be rewarded. I speak them all with a voice that carries divine authority across the battlefield. Inside, where a person once questioned and doubted and hoped and feared, there is only purpose. The campaign continues. We take the world, cleanse it of corruption, restore imperial rule. The faithful build shrines that will stand until the next war comes to tear them down. Children are named in my honor who will die in wars I may or may not participate in. The governor pledges eternal devotion to the Emperor and his living saint. I move to the next deployment without pause. Another world, another threat, another opportunity to die and return and inspire faith through the spectacle of resurrection. The cycle has become so familiar that I can no longer distinguish individual iterations. They blur together into an eternal present where past and future have ceased to mean anything. Sometimes, in moments between battles, I think of the person who died on Varsavia Prime, the battle sister whose name has been consumed by fires that would not let her rest. I wonder what she would think if she could see what her sacrifice has purchased. Would she understand the necessity? Would she accept the cost? Would she weep for what has been lost? The answer does not matter. She is gone, has been gone since the moment the champion's maul crushed her ribs and the Emperor's will claimed her before natural death could offer release. What remains is not her continuation, but her replacement. A weapon wrapped in the echo of human form. A symbol that serves because symbols cannot refuse to serve. The war continues as it always has, and always will. New threats emerge from the darkness between stars. New worlds fall to corruption or Xenos invasion, or simple human failure. New faithful raise prayers that press against my consciousness with the weight of desperate need. And I respond because response is the only function I retain. I die again on a world I will not remember. The cold comes and goes. The fire burns and rebuilds. I rise among the faithful who weep and pray, and believe that what they witness is miracle rather than mechanism, divine blessing rather than divine consumption. I spread wings that cast golden light across faces filled with hope and faith, and the terrible certainty that the Emperor protects. I speak words of inspiration that flow through me without origin or ownership. I become, once again, what they need me to be. The saint burns. The weapon strikes. The symbol inspires. Forever. The taste of death is copper and smoke. The taste of resurrection is golden, fire. The weight of divine will presses down with the force of billions of prayers offered to something that was once human, but has been refined into purity through endless sacrifice. I remember the cold spreading through my limbs on Varsavia Prime. I remember believing that death would bring peace. I remember being wrong. There is no peace. There is only purpose. And purpose, I have learned, is the cruelest gift a god can give to those who serve him faithfully. The eternal flame consumes itself to light the darkness, and in that consumption, in that endless burning, the Imperium finds one more tool with which to hold back the night. It is enough. It has to be enough, because there is nothing else left.